Good morning. I am sitting right now in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and getting ready to go to the Super Bowl. Now, only one of those things is correct, and I'll let you figure out which one it is. But we're going to get started this morning, and I hope this week that you were in Core 52. We were supposed to be reading chapter 9 about finding happiness. And I wanted to tell you a little story from my childhood as we get started this morning. I lived in a small town called Fredericktown, Missouri for a little while, and we moved there when I was in first grade. I didn't know anyone, and so making new friends is always extremely important, especially as a kid when you move to a new town. There was a girl next door, and unfortunately for the life of me, I can't really remember her name, and I'm not even sure that matters, except for the story's sake. This girl next door was about 2 years older than me, and she was the tomboy of all tomboys. I mean, she rode bikes with the boys in the neighborhood. She helped us build ramps and invent ways to injure ourselves. She went around the neighborhood with my brother and I, and we'd find slugs and pour salt on them. And so she was just fun and energetic and adventurous. She was happy, and I really enjoyed being around her. Now, because she was a couple years older than me, and I was only probably 6 or 7 at the time, I didn't really understand for sure what was going on. I just knew that I liked to be around her. And she would often invite me over to her house, and we'd watch Little Mermaid together, and she'd share her snacks and her juice boxes, and it was a good old time. Now, I realized at the time that Little Mermaid was the 6-7-year-old equivalent to a chick flick, and so I watched it because she liked it. I remember one day after our friendship was kind of developing, that she was coming down the street with her mom in their vehicle, and I saw their car coming down this little hill that led to our houses, and out of nowhere, I'm not really sure what happened, but the back passenger door flew wide open, and simultaneously my friend also flew out of the car. And now, her mom was probably only going 15, 20 miles per hour, but that's pretty fast. And to see her body fall out of that back seat and begin rolling down the street, it was like one of those standstill moments where you wish you could just stop everything and fix the problem. And what happened next is kind of a blur in my mind. I just know that the ambulance came and she was rushed off to the hospital, and she was gone for days. And when she came back, something was different. And now I realize, sitting here years later, that I didn't see what was going on behind the scenes. And that included doctor appointment after doctor appointment, traveling to physical therapy, relearning some really normal things like how to walk and run. And then I realize now, but didn't then, that she sat inside watching her friends play. And I remember that even after she healed up from all of those experiences, something about her changed. Her energy, her adventurous spirit, her smile, most of all, her happiness seemed to just fly out the window, out the door with her that day. And I won't ever forget that she changed. This week with Core 52, you probably spent some time in the book of Job, specifically chapters 1 and 2. Now, the story of Job is one that many of us recognize. We've read it before, we've heard it preached before. It's a pretty tough story because what we see is this man, Job, who has an amazing life, deal with some extremely terrible circumstances where he seems to lose everything. And when he loses everything, no doubt his happiness goes with him. I'd like to open up the book of Job with you today. If you have your Bibles, I encourage you to go to Job chapter 1. Job 1 verse 1 begins like this. In the land of Uz, there lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. Now, immediately we learn some really cool things about Job. But the word that sticks out more than any other in that verse about his introduction is this idea of Now, when we hear the word blameless, we immediately go to the idea of perfection, that we can't be blamed for any wrongdoing. I'm not exactly sure that that's what the Bible is trying to illustrate for us. Job, in the idea of being blameless, it wasn't that he was sinless, it wasn't that he was perfect, it was about him being consistent. That if you look at the overall direction of his life, you'll see that he's going in the same direction. Now, while he may make some mistakes and there are certainly hiccups in the road, if you look at the overall direction of his life, you know where he's going. Know anybody like that? I mean, they're not perfect. My grandparents, they're, in my opinion, the closest to perfection that I've ever met. Now, they've made mistakes, and they'll be the first to claim that, but I look at the overall direction of their lives, and I see where they're going. And God says that we can experience that same blamelessness, and Job's so many questions about Job, and truth is, we don't know a lot about this guy, other than the fact that he's from the land of Uz, but no one really knows where that's at. It's like this magical place filled with colorful horses and yellow brick roads. We don't really know where it was at. And furthermore, Job himself and his beginnings, they're a mystery. We don't know what time frame in which he lived. We honestly don't know who wrote this book. There's all of these. Job's name means one of two things. It either means, where is my father, or I have no father. How's that for a name? Job is a mystery. And we have to ask, well, why didn't he have a dad? Did his dad leave him? Did his dad die? Or did Job never know his father? And if any of those situations are the case, then Job's happiness from the very beginning of his life was an extremely huge hill to try to tackle. Job chapter 1 verse 2 says, Job had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 donkeys, and had a large number of servants. He was the greatest man among all the people of the East. And so we see that maybe as a result of his blamelessness, maybe because his life was consistent, that he was experiencing all these blessings. And many of the blessings were material in basis. You know, they were livestock, they were possessions, they were materials that Job could see, that he could touch, that he could hold on to. And we see that his blamelessness kind of led him in the right direction. Verse 4, his sons used to take turns holding feasts in their homes, and they would invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. When a period of fasting had run its course, Job would send and have them purified. Early in the morning, he would sacrifice a burnt offering for each of them, thinking, perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. And this was Job's regular custom. And so Job was blameless, apparently, in his dealings with other people. He was also blameless in the way he led his family. It was consistent. He was always going in the same direction. And Job thought that when his kids got together, there's a chance that they messed up. That maybe they drank too much, maybe they partied a little too much. And Job thought, well, maybe if I, on their behalf, if I offer these sacrifices to God, then maybe he will overlook some of the issues in my kids' lives. Now we know that each one of us is held responsible for our own actions. And I think Job knew that too. But still, Job knew that part of his happiness, perhaps, came from living a blameless life, one that was consistent, one that was always going in the same direction, both in his dealings with his possessions as well as in his dealings with raising and leading. Let's look at more of Job's story. Verse 6 says this, "One day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. The Lord said to Satan, 'Where have you come from?' And Satan answered the Lord, 'From roaming through the earth and going back and forth in it.' Then the Lord said to Satan, 'Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil.' Does Job fear God for nothing?" Satan replied. "Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands, so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well then, everything he has is in your hands, but on the man himself do not lay a finger." We ask the question, does God want us to be happy? Perhaps another question we could ask is, does Satan want us to be happy? And I think over and over again we've lied to ourselves thinking that Satan is this big ball of fun, that many times sin, which, let's be honest, the reason we sin is because it's enjoyable, that sin, and if we continue to do that more, then we think we're locked into this party, right? And we see in Job's story that it was certainly not Satan who was wanting Job to be happy. In fact, Satan's name is the opposer, or the adversary, or the accuser, or the father of lies. Satan's ideal situation is to make our lives miserable. And so while we may not have yet answered the question, does God want us to be happy, we've certainly answered the other question, does Satan want us to be happy? And the obvious answer from Job's life is no. He wants us. The thing that stands out about Job's life to us most is how his incredibly blessed life, happy life, all comes crashing down in the blink of an eye. Job 1, starting at verse 13, is where this is recorded. It says, "One day when Job's sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, 'The oxen were plowing, and the donkeys were grazing nearby, and the Sabaeans attacked and carried them off. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you.' While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, 'The fire of God fell from the sky and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you.' While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, 'The Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on your camels and carried them off. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you.' So all of Job's herds, from his sheep to his oxen to his cattle to his camels, and all of his farmers and all of the servants who took care of that livestock, they were all wiped out in what appears to be a blink of an eye. And if that's not bad enough, you probably know the rest of the story. Verse 18 says, "While he was still speaking, yet another messenger came and said, 'Your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, when suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on them, and they are dead. And I am the only one who has escaped to tell you.'" When I read that passage, first I have to recognize and realize that it seems a little bit over the top. You know what I mean? Like, how can all of those things, all of those bad things possibly happen in the same day? But then I realized that it is possible. I'm sure you've experienced a snowball effect in your life, like when one thing goes wrong, it just seems like they keep occurring one after the other, and you have to wonder, is it ever going to stop? Job was having one of those days. His specific circumstances, though, were heightened, right? They were elevated. And the question is why? Why are they elevated? And we find out that it was because God allowed Satan to do whatever he wanted to make Job's life miserable, except for the fact of actually harming him physically and taking his life. And when you realize that, it makes you ask, does God play a part in our suffering? Then what does that mean about happiness? You see, these same types of questions are often asked when we're at low points in our lives. And many times the answers to those questions don't come. We say things like, why did this happen to me? Right? Or we ask, how much time do I have? Or we ask, what am I supposed to do now? And if you've ever asked any of those questions, you know the answers don't really seem to come. And though many of those questions can't be answered this side of heaven, there are a few things that I think Job teaches us that we can do. Now, all of these three things are found in two short verses. It's Job chapter 1, verses 20 and 21. You'll see Job 1:20 says this, "At this," in other words, when Job heard about all the bad news, "at this, Job got up and tore his robe and shaved his head. Then he fell to the ground in worship." Now, I don't know about you, but oftentimes my first response to bad news, Job, his immediate response, one of worship, is to worship God. When all hell broke loose, our Bible literally says that Job fell on his knees in worship to God. Now, I don't think anything that happens on earth escapes God's notice. I don't think that the bad experiences and circumstances that we deal with that ruin our happiness, I don't think God ignores those. But that doesn't make us exempt from pain and suffering. God in himself, in the form of man, we know him as Jesus, experienced pain and suffering, right? I don't think there's any way that as human beings we can possibly escape pain and suffering. But what we can do is react well to our bad circumstances. Job teaches us that if we're going to respond well to our bad circumstances, the first thing that we have to do is look to God. We need to fall on our knees in worship, even in the bad moments. Why? I think because it restores our happiness. The second thing that happens, we find in verse 21. After Job fell to the ground in worship, he said this, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart." Now, I don't think Job says this to feel sorry for himself. I think he says this because he's being honest with himself. Just like you and I won't be able to take any of our possessions with us, Job is basically saying the same thing. I came into this world with nothing. I'm going to leave with nothing. That's just how it is. It doesn't matter what other people place in our caskets when we're buried, because none of those things are going to go with us anyway. Suffering has a way of revealing to us what really matters. Have you ever noticed that? Suffering can produce happiness if our perspective remains focused on what really matters in life. So the first thing Job did was he looked to God. The second thing he did was he looked inside. He kind of did a spiritual inventory, if you will, of what really matters in my life. The third thing is found in the second half of verse 21. It says, "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." Instead of being filled with bitterness, Job seems to end this by being hopeful. Why? Because he trusts that God has something better in store for him. An imaginary story I'd like to share with you today about a guy named Bert. Now, Bert lived on the edge of town in a little single-wide blue and white trailer. Bert was, as most people would describe, odd. He walked around town, often moving his lips, seeming to talk to himself. He rarely said a word to anybody, but smiled every time they greeted him. Bert would pull around this little red wagon all over town. And oftentimes Bert could be found digging through dumpsters and trash cans behind local businesses and even some residences, as long as people didn't run him off. And as he dug through those dumpsters and trash cans, he'd pull out certain treasures, if you will, and he'd throw them in his little red wagon and he'd move on to the next stop. Oftentimes Bert would take his little red wagon to the local salvage yard and he would try to salvage anything of value. This is just an odd lifestyle for most people. No one really knew, though, what was different about Bert or what caused him to be different. Many speculated that he was injured seriously in an automobile accident as a kid, but no one really knew if that were true or not. And as you can imagine, that when he met many local kids in the streets, they would reenact some of the things that they heard their parents saying about Bert behind closed doors. They'd say things like, "Hey Bert, did your mom actually have any kids that lived?" Or they'd say things like, "Bert, if you put your brains in a glass jar, they'd look like a duck on Mark Twain Lake." And as you remember, kids can be mean, and they'd say things like, "Roses are red, violets are blue, Bert is so dumb he belongs in the zoo." And every time they would, Bert would just smile and nod and continue on his path. The people of town found Bert one Saturday morning. He was sitting in his chair looking out the window of his blue and white trailer on the edge of town, only this time Bert was dead. They discovered a will, neatly folded and placed in a little box next to his chair. And inside that box was also $80,000 that Bert had managed to save. It was all bequeathed to the community that he loved. And one simple line told the whole story. In scribbles that people were barely able to read, Bert wrote this: "I don't know why all this happened to me. But when bad things happen to people, only God matters." Now, pain and suffering are going to find every single one of us. The big question is, does God have anything to do with it? And if God does have something to do with pain and suffering, does he really want us to be happy? Now, there will be times when our pain and suffering have reasons behind them. They'll be evident. We'll know that sometimes the bad choices that we've made will catch up to us. But there will be other times when our pain and suffering makes absolutely no sense, much like Job's. And maybe you're going through one of those times right now. Maybe it seems like you're going through this dark tunnel where the weight of the world is on your shoulders and you're never going to find your way out. Maybe you're thinking, "I don't know if I'll ever be happy again." If that's you, it's time to take the path Job took. It's time to look to God, to take a look inside, and then to take a look beyond. There, we will find true happiness. And oh yeah, go Chiefs.